Well, I want to welcome everyone to our Reagan EDU chat today. My name is Tony Penny. I am the Chief Learning Officer at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute, and I am very excited for our discussion today. Today we will be discussing the 1980 election, so we are taking a trip back in history, 40 years, to the election of 1980 between Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter. We have a fantastic panel today. And just a sign of how much the times have changed. So we're obviously within the context of the 2020 election. This election 40 years ago, it was a Democratic governor from a southern state versus a Republican governor from California. My, how the times have changed since then. And with that, I'm going to jump into it, and I'm going to give a brief introduction of each of our panelists first. So we're very excited to have with us today 4 panelists. So first, Jerry Rafshoon, an American TV producer, political operative. He worked in the White House Communications Office under the presidency of Jimmy Carter, is an award-winning television producer. So we're excited to have him. Welcome, Jerry.
Thank you.
We also have Les Francis. So Les Francis has worked in the highest level of politics and government at the national level. He was chief of staff to then Representative Norm Mineta, and Deputy Assistant and Deputy White House Chief of Staff to President Jimmy Carter. He's also one of the leading voices on civic learning in the country, which is how we know him. Thanks for joining us today, Les.
Thank you, Tony.
We also have Mari Maseng-Will, a debate coach for Republican political candidates, as well as a media and communications consultant for major corporations. She was assistant to the president and director of communications for President Reagan, and a speechwriter for President Reagan, and served on his senior staff as director of public liaison. So Mari, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And last but not least, we have Craig Shirley. Craig is a renowned presidential historian, New York Times best-selling author, having written 4 best-selling books and dozens of articles about Ronald Reagan. In addition to that, he is also on the board of trustees at Eureka College, President Reagan's alma mater, and has worked in government and campaigns at the congressional, gubernatorial, and presidential levels, including the 1980 and 84 campaigns. So we're very excited to have you as well. So thank you for joining us, Craig.
Thank you, Tony.
Excellent. So our audience, we work with teachers and students from across the country, and obviously the election of 2020 is top of mind. And so we thought it would be interesting to give folks a glimpse at what is going on in an election behind the scenes. So as we tune back to 1980, the first thing I'd like to have each of you share a little bit is, what was your role on the campaign and what were you primarily focused on? So I'm going to have you each introduce yourself, talk a little bit about your role. So I'm going to start with Jerry. So in 1980, what was your primary role on the campaign?
You asked me?
Yes.
I left I was communication director of the White House, but I had only come in for about a year and a half. After having done the campaign, the advertising and publicity, the advertising for the election in 1976. I go back a long way with Jimmy Carter to 1966, when I had just started my advertising agency in Atlanta, and I met a farmer who wanted to run for governor. And I fell in love after I met him. And I did that campaign, which we almost won. Thank goodness we didn't. And 4 years later, I did the campaign in 1970 for governor, long shot campaign. And then after we won that, and Jimmy Carter went on the national scene when he got up at his inauguration with all the segregationist former governors seated there, and he had the Annapolis band and the Morris Brown African-American College Glee Club singing the Battle Hymn of the Republic, and he said the time for racial discrimination is over. It was then that I even thought we can go further than that, and so I did the advertising and communications for the campaign of 1976. We were called the Georgia Mafia. Myself and Hamilton Jordan and Jody Powell were 3 close aides to Governor Carter. Then I spent about a year and a half in the White House as communications director, and left in order to go back to my agency, my advertising agency, and set up a headquarters in Washington to do the advertising and consulting for the re-election campaign, and which started with the famous and infamous challenge by Ted Kennedy for the nomination, and but I always knew we would beat him for the nomination. I've said it before. What I have to add here is that after the New Hampshire primary, when Jimmy Carter had dispatched Ted Kennedy, I went into the Oval Office and said, "Mr. President, you not only beat Kennedy, but we'll get Kennedy out, but you've got a bonus. Ronald Reagan is going to be the Republican nominee." And he said, "Do you think that's a good idea?" He said, "I'm not so sure that is a bonus."
Yeah, well,
So you showed us, Craig, you all showed us that Jimmy was right at that time.
That's a good segue into what was going on the other side of the campaign. So maybe I'll throw it to Mari. Mari, what was your role in the 1980 campaign?
Well, I was 26 years old at the time, and I went to Detroit for the nominating convention with Bob Dole, who had run in the primaries. I was his press person, communications person. And we decided to go during the first week at the convention when not much news is happening, and we held a media event every single day. And we got Dole on the national news every single day. And that caught the, or night, and that caught the attention of the Reagan campaign, which was having a problem with its message being disrupted by frequent Reagan gaffes. You might remember killer trees and things like that. And so they wanted to form a group that would work with the very top of the campaign, separate from the RNC surrogate group, to make attacks at Carter and his cabinet and his campaign to distract the news from covering Reagan's gaffes. And they hired me for that. And we called ourselves the Bomb Squad, and we had a fabulous time.
Excellent, excellent. So thank you very much, Mari. Now I'm going to go to Les. What was your role in the 80 campaign?
Well, I had worked in the 76 campaign as a volunteer in the Pennsylvania primary, and then on staff in the California and the general in 76, and ended up on the White House staff, first in congressional liaison. And then as time evolved, I sort of got more and more drawn into Hamilton Jordan's orbit. And when he became chief of staff in the summer of 79, I joined his office as a deputy. But one of my responsibilities was to be the liaison between the White House staff and the campaign. And then eventually Hamilton and the president and the vice president asked me to go over to the campaign and join Tim Kraft over there. Given the lineup of the people asking, I wasn't sure what the appeals route would be if I said I didn't want to. But I went over to the campaign, and my title was staff director, but basically I ran the field operation in the primaries. I was executive director of the DNC for the summer of 80, and then brought back to the campaign as acting campaign manager in the fall of 1980. So I have the dubious distinction of having been the campaign manager of incumbent presidential campaign that lost 44 states.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you, Les. And then last but not least, Craig.
I'd worked in conservative causes and campaigns my short adult life as of 1979. And in 1978, I've been the press secretary for a guy named Gordon Humphrey, who ran in New Hampshire and in one of the biggest upset in the country, defeated the three-term incumbent Tom McIntyre, United States Senator. I went with Humphrey to his Senate office for several months to organize his press operation. And it was just this time that Reagan was ramping up. there was also a conservative group, which actually was fairly prominent at the time, Fund for a Conservative Majority. And along about January of 1980, they wanted to run an independent expenditure campaign in support of Reagan in the primaries and the general election. And they approached me to run it. And I was, of course, delighted to do so because I've been a Reagan supporter my entire life. And it turned out to be prescient on their part because Reagan lost the Iowa caucuses, and in this intervening 6 weeks was headed for, was not looking good in New Hampshire and the subsequent primaries. Fund for a Conservative Majority gave me a budget of then $700,000, which was a lot of money in those days. I went into a decrepit studio in Georgetown and produced 30 and 60-second commercials and bought radio time wall to wall on farm reports, sports reports, Sunday religious programming from in the New Hampshire primary and all the way through the next 6 primaries, and we were able to, I think, contribute a lot to helping Reagan win the 1980 nomination, because the rules of the time prohibited you from going from an independent expenditure to the official campaign. I couldn't do so, so I went and worked on several campaigns around the country, and then came back in 81 and went to work for the Republican National Committee, which was by then the political arm of the Reagan White House.
Excellent. Thank you, Craig. So for our viewers out there, one of the things I think is really interesting listening to all of you is just the various levels to which you are working on campaigns. And when they think about the way that campaigns function now, obviously there's a lot of differences, but some of the similarities, obviously, coordinating for the incumbent, coordinating between the White House and the campaign, outside groups, obviously we have political action committees that do a lot of kind of outside support for candidates. Staffers who are working on communications at kind of lower levels and higher levels. So it's interesting to see and to have such a diverse set of panelists for that. So, one of the things that really drives elections is issues. So we have a unique set of issues in 2020. Obviously, we have a number of kind of historic challenges that we're facing here in the present with, everything from the pandemic to the economy to civil rights and that sort of thing. But if we rewind 40 years and we think about the issues that were driving voters and that were top of mind for voters then, what were the issues or issue that you were most focused on? I think of the 1980 election and things like the Cold War, the economy, the hostages, that sort of thing were top of mind. I was not there, living it, but I'd be interested to hear from your perspective and your work on the campaign. What were the biggest issues that were driving you? Maybe I'll go to Les first this time.
Well, Tony, I think you have to separate from our standpoint the primary and the fight up to the convention and then post-convention. In the primaries, as Jerry mentioned, we were faced with the challenge from Senator Kennedy and from Governor Brown, although Jerry Brown from California, who'd also run in 76, so it was nothing much more than a nuisance in 1980. But Senator Kennedy presented a serious challenge. And I wouldn't say there was any one specific issue, although he tried to rally people around national health care. It was more the if you will, the institutional left of the Democratic Party, which never really warmed up to Jimmy Carter, because Carter was a centrist on economic issues and other things. And then there was, frankly, just the Kennedy ambition and trying to reclaim a legacy.
Entitlement.
Yeah, entitlement, exactly. And so, to some extent, it was a clash of personalities and to some extent ideology in the primary. In the general, we were still dealing with the hostage crisis in Tehran. That was a defining issue. And the economic fallout from that and other things that had been building, the pressures of inflation and so forth. And but a point I want to make is that every presidential campaign is obviously run within a larger context. 1976, Jimmy Carter was the ideal candidate for that time and that year. post-Watergate, post-Vietnam, and so forth. There was nobody better situated than Carter in that context. To some extent, Ronald Reagan was similarly positioned. He'd run twice before, and in 68 and 76, and had fallen short. I think in the Republican Party, there tends to be a phenomenon where it was more his turn than it was somebody else's. But the other is that he came really to the forefront in 1980 against a backdrop of a lot of other things that were happening in the 70s. A political and social tide moving to the right, whether it was on abortion or ERA or the battle over the Panama Canals. And he was able to ride that sentiment very successfully. But the defining issues, as it were, in the Reagan versus Carter fight were the hostages and what that said or didn't say about America's strength and the problems with the economy, interest rate, inflation, and so forth.
Sure. I'm gonna go to Craig now, kind of in response. So thinking about the primaries and what it was that helped Reagan emerge from that pretty crowded Republican field, what were some of the issues you think that helped him stand out among that field?
There were horizontal issues and there were vertical issues. The horizontal issues were the Cold War, America standing in the world, and the Iranian hostage. Vertical issues on the side and be tax cuts, C, our defense posture, and then various and sundry social issues. And those were all, adopted, debated on by the various Republican candidates. Don't forget there were 7 candidates running that year. And some of them were very impressive individuals. You had Senator Robert Dole, Senator Howard Baker.
Hello?
Oh, Craig, I think your audio cut out for a second there. Maybe we'll pick that up in a second. I'm gonna maybe jump over to Mari at this point. So Mari, you were working with Bob Dole early in the primary. From that perspective, what did you see as the defining issues, and what was it that helped President Reagan emerge?
Well, of course, I think the defining moment in the primary was something that I was involved in. Now, it was a minor moment, but I think it was a pivotal moment for Reagan, which was the Nashua Debate. George Bush and Bob Dole, who I were working for, didn't like each other very much because they were competing with each other as rising stars in the Republican Party. And Dole thought he had been unfairly overlooked in favor of Bush for a key party position. And so the competition was nasty. And when Bush decided to try to clear the focus and make it mano a mano with him and Reagan, he got the Reagan campaign to agree to a one-on-one debate in Nashua. And this incensed my boss, Bob Dole. And he sent me down to Nashua to try to figure out how to disrupt the debate. And it was a lot of fun because I would walk around in the hall down there and try to find, a horde of press following me, giving quotes, trying to put pressure on the two campaigns to let us in, having a lot of fun, which I always did with Bob Dole. And, were we going to have a different spot? Were we going to cut the electricity? Were we going to, simultaneous debates? What was going on? Finally, we decided that there was no good way to make enough media just doing something at an outside event. So Bob Dole got the idea that we would actually physically disrupt the debate. And he worked the phones with all the other candidates, with the Reagan campaign staffers. And we organized a surprise for George Bush, where all the candidates lined up outside and then marched on stage and stood behind Reagan and Bush. Reagan kind of knew what was going to happen. Bush didn't. He was paralyzed. I remember him just like looking down at the table. He didn't know what to do. Reagan wanted to let the others participate. The moderator objected, and that's the defining moment that I will always love Reagan for. He grabbed the microphone and he said,
I paid.
Yes, I paid for this microphone, Mr. Green. Of course, it was Mr. Breen. But anyway, that's the moment I love most about that campaign, the primary campaign.
Excellent. All right. It looks like we have Craig back. I just want to give Craig an opportunity to finish up his point, and then we'll go to Jerry. So Craig, it looks like you're muted, but
Mary,
Yeah.
hello?
Yes. Hi, Jerry.
Did anybody ever tell Reagan that, or did you realize that that line came from the movie State of the Union when Spencer Tracy said it in the same context?
I'm sure.
When they try to cut him, he was running for president, I think, and they try to cut him out, and he said, "I paid for that microphone."
I'm sure Ronald Reagan.
He knew.
okay.
He knew his lines.
Yes, exactly.
Let me throw to Craig. Craig, it looks like you're back with us.
Yeah, I lost the trend of the topic. What was it, Tony?
Oh, so just the major issues and what you were seeing from your point of view. You know, what was the issue driving kind of the primary for Reagan from the vantage point that you had when you came in post Iowa to help kind of drive that nomination? Oh, it looks like
Tony,
yes.
could I follow up? One thing I forgot to mention, the reason why I think it was important for Reagan, because it showed him in a position of strength. And because of the hostages, the Malaise speech, a lot of other things that were happening, people began to see Carter as weak. So this was his breakthrough moment as a strong, decisive candidate, and he carried that all the way through to the end. So that's why I think it was important.
Okay. Thank you, Mari. Craig? Looks like we're still continuing to have some.
Reagan was developing a new set of issues that were completely his own on defense policy, on social policy, and on tax policy, on government regulation policy. Is that, you know, since the late 40s, containment and later détente had been the official U.S. Position with regard to the Soviet Union. Reagan's first major candidate to come along says is that we're not going to coexist with the Soviet Union. We're going to transcend the Soviet Union. He was the one who actively, openly ran on military superiority rather than just parity with the Soviet Union. So this is a new issue. Tax cuts had been the province of the Democratic Party, at least since the time of John Kennedy. But tax cuts and
I think you know, appropriate for the day, which is the 40th anniversary of the 1980 debate. I want to take a bit of issue with Craig's point. Carter actually had started the buildup to counter the Soviet Union in our defense budgets, and it was one of the problems, frankly, that created tension in the Democratic Party between the Kennedy forces and us, which was Carter's insistence on upping our defense capacity, especially in the area of offensive missiles and so forth. So the buildup, actually post-Vietnam buildup, started during the Carter administration, as did, by the way, people don't realize, the early investments in stealth technology. All of that started in the Carter administration, as did our decision to.
Carter was very much wedded to his salt tree, which would have reduced the MX missile, would have reduced the B-2 bomber, B-1 bomber. It would have reduced a whole class of new military weapons. So is that, yes, there was some military buildup.
Well, this is a point of dispute. I can assure you that the Democratic left did not think that Carter was soft on defense. In fact, they took issue with our defense.
Les, I think one of the problems that you faced was Carter was trying to balance the budget. Isn't that true? And so that
Absolutely.
limited his ability to spend on defense budgets. And there was a problem with spare parts and those kinds of things because he couldn't spend as much as he wanted to spend or needed to be spent because he was trying to balance the budget.
Which also hurt us on domestic programs.
Yes, exactly.
And if I could turn to Jerry real quick, we haven't heard from Jerry on the primary. You mentioned earlier, the challenge within the Democratic Party, from Ted Kennedy. Obviously, the Kennedys are kind of a Democratic elite, a legacy of Democratic leadership. What do you think it was that allowed President Carter to overcome that challenge? What was the big issue on the Democratic side in the primary that led to him emerging?
Well, you got to realize that any time, I think it still happens that, and it happened then, that any time the sitting president has been challenged in his own primaries for the nomination, the challenger does not get the nomination, but he does cripple the incumbent in his reelection. And this happened. We never could, the Kennedy people never stopped. In fact, they wanted Carter to lose the general election. And that was very evident in our convention when Ted Kennedy refused to even do the traditional handshake. He was stuttering. He had other problems, but and so that probably what happened. Our two. I used to say that the reason people. I'm not discounting Ronald Reagan's abilities and Ronald Reagan's great campaign. But I said, when people ask me, I said, was it like the triple K? Kennedy, Khomeini, and I throw in Koch, who was the mayor of New York, along with Jane Byrne, who was the mayor of Chicago. The left wing of the Democratic Party never gave Carter permission to come to Washington and never gave him permission to win. And it's sour grapes, of course, but we were pretty wounded from the primary. Had Kennedy gotten out after New Hampshire, well, he thought he was going to, actually, Steve Smith had said to Kennedy when they were going to Iowa, he said, I heard from a reporter who was on the plane, said, as soon as we beat Carter in Iowa, I'll go to the White House and see Carter, get him to get out of the race. When I heard that, I said, if that happens, I want to be in that meeting. So I think one of the biggest mistakes that we made was that because of the hostages, Carter wouldn't campaign till very late in the primaries. And Carter was in addition to have great advertising, he was a great one-on-one campaigner. He and Reagan both. And I think that time that staying out till practically, till after the hostage crisis, because of the hostage crisis, hurt us a lot.
Can I just pick up on something too, just to go back to the primary dynamics for us? Our strategy was to knock Kennedy out early. Jerry mentioned Iowa and New Hampshire. We had Iowa, New Hampshire, Vermont, Maine, Florida, and Massachusetts all came as a cluster. We beat Kennedy in 5 of the 6. We didn't even contest Massachusetts, but we won in Iowa, New Hampshire, Vermont, Maine, and Florida, thereby undercutting any claim that Kennedy had that he was the inevitable winner or that Carter was the inevitable loser. The problem was Kennedy didn't get the message, and he stayed in until the convention, and it was very, very destructive to our prospects in the general election, because we came out of New York with a divided party, a bitterly divided party.
Excellent. And I want to pick up a little bit on that, the spirit of, you said, Jerry, you said Kennedy and Carter didn't even shake hands. I want to rewind really quickly to 1976, because we saw a pretty strong challenge to an incumbent president from the Republican Party, where Ronald Reagan took it to the convention and came very close.
Same thing, yeah.
Same thing. And Craig, I know you've written about this extensively. I don't know if you have any comments on that before we jump back to 1980.
But Republicans tend to come together a lot faster. They're
Yeah,
much more loyal
that's
to
not
the
that's not
candidate.
really, Jerry. That's not really true in 1976. Is that Gerald Ford and Ronald Reagan and their forces never really came together at a post convention meeting of Reagan supporters. Lynn Knopfsinger, who was a longtime aide to Gerald Ford, was asked by one of the disconsolate Reagan supporters what their demeanor should be toward the Ford people, and Knopfsinger quipped, "Demeanor the better." I think that was kind of representative of the feeling of all the Reaganites toward the Ford people throughout the campaign and throughout '76. I'm going to go into detail here, but Ford ran a very, very tough campaign against Reagan in the primaries. At one point, he ran commercial advertising accusing Reagan of wanting to start a war. The tagline was that on Tuesday, remember, Governor Reagan couldn't start a war, President Reagan could. Reagan was furious about it. Is that Reagan went to that podium in Camp Arena in Kansas City of 1976 because he was a party man, because the party wanted him there, not because Gerald Ford wanted him there. There was never any love lost between the two men. Mrs. Reagan and Mrs. Ford couldn't be in the same county with each other. That's how little they liked each other. And the Ford people and the Reagan people never, ever reconciled, even in Detroit in 1980, when there was a dance for several days about a possible co-presidency between Gerald Ford and Ronald Reagan. There was never ever any love lost between these two men.
And ironically, Jerry Ford and Jimmy Carter became good friends afterwards.
And so now I want to come, let's we've talked a little bit about the primaries. I want to talk a little bit about, obviously today is the 40th anniversary of that pivotal debate, the 1980 election. There was one debate between President Carter and Governor Reagan at the time. Obviously, we've had a couple more debates this time around. President Reagan had gone through a little bit of a gauntlet. He had gone through the Republican primaries, been involved in several debates, including, that was a fairly strong field. You have another future president in George H.W. Bush, another presidential candidate down the road in Bob Dole. So as we get close to this debate, which is, about a week or so ahead of the election day, what's going through your minds as campaign staffers as you come to, the race was pretty close according to some of the polls. It seems like this is going to be a big impact on what the final results are. What sorts of things are going through your head as a staffer working on the campaign? I'll shoot it to Mari first this time.
Well, I wasn't involved directly with the debate preparation, but we were trying to create an environment or affect the environment surrounding the debate to throw Carter off his game, distract their campaign, and to maybe raise issues in reporters' minds as to what the questions should be, and in the people's minds about what they wanted to know. And the main thing we were thinking about was defense, as Craig was talking about. I think Reagan was called it our defense equipment was held together with chewing gum and baling wire. the hostage situation, which is you remember or you might know, Ted Koppel was hosting Americans held hostage, and every night was a clock counting.
Oh, I remember that well.
That was very effective counting. It was better than an advertisement. It was every single night. It was constantly kept the issue constantly in front of the Americans' mind. We were trying to present an image of Carter as being weak and impotent, and then also, of course, the misery index, which we were hitting. We were finding various new economic numbers every time a new one would come out to point out how bad off the American people were at that moment compared to where they were 4 years ago, which led to Reagan's line in the debate, "Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago?"
Excellent. I'll throw it over to Jerry. Jerry, what were you thinking? As you're getting closer to the debate, from your perspective in the campaign, what were the big issues and what was top of mind for President Carter?
I think it was a mistake for us to not debate earlier. President felt very strongly that he didn't want to be after the hostage crisis started, he didn't want to be in a debate that would be debating the hostages. And he had to really think about his message that would go to the Iranians. What people didn't know, Carter was pretty tough about the hostage crisis. What he didn't know, I mean, everybody was calling for go ahead and go over there and bomb Iran, go ahead and punish them. And every time somebody would come up with an idea that of what we could do, and Carter would say, will that get the hostages out? And he would, and people would say no, but it would make the American people feel better if you did something like that. And he said, I'm not going to gamble with their lives for political purposes. So we didn't we didn't go into the campaign, or Carter didn't start traveling until after the convention, and that I think was a mistake politically. But as you talk about Ted Koppel, I think of a year after we were back out of the White House. Actually, it was a couple of years after, because it was after the hostages got out. Ted Koppel had a special, or ABC had a special, and they came to me about if Jimmy would do a remote from Georgia, from Plains, to be on the special. And I said, I don't really want to ask him, but I finally did, and he did go on it. And at the end of Ted Koppel's discussion, it was then Nightline. Remember, that started the program Nightline, and Carter said, Ted Koppel said, well, at the end of this, Mr. President, before we leave, did anything good come out of the hostage crisis? Carter looked at him and said, well, it did for you, Ted. You got a show every night. He wasn't too tactful about it. He didn't have to worry about satisfying the networks. But yes, I keep saying, again, I go through the 3 Ks, Kennedy, Koch, and Khomeini.
Yeah, Tony, the debate decision for that one-time debate in October, as Jerry suggested, comes against a backdrop of us not debating Kennedy in the primaries and not engaged in the 3-person debate with John Anderson and Governor Reagan.
That's right.
In the fall. By the time the League of Women Voters changed their minds about the standard about they had decided, and they were the then sponsors of the debates. They no longer are. That a candidate who was at 15% in the polls should be included. Well, in September, I think it was, John Anderson was in excess of 15%. He was up 18, 20% or so. And we decided, the Carter team decided, we were not going to debate with Anderson on the stage and give him the platform that was going to only come at our expense. So then he dropped below 15%. The league re-extended their invitation to Governor Reagan and President Carter. And we were sort of stuck then because we hadn't debated Kennedy, we hadn't debated Anderson. And if we had failed to debate Reagan, he would have been accused of ducking the debates completely. The other thing was, at the time of the debates, the polls, and Jerry will remember this clearly, I sure do, in the run up to the debate, things were truly neck and neck. And in fact, we had been gaining.
It's true.
We were looking pretty good in the days before October 28th. And we would much rather have not had to debate, but because of that history of not debating in the primaries and in the earlier part of the general, we were sort of stuck. And I was almost had to debate. There was no graceful way, no politically smart way not to debate, and it was it clearly was a pivotal moment.
The debate, our debate negotiators were me and Bob Strauss. We were up against Jim Baker. And Jim Baker and Bob Strauss were great friends. And I remember making a point, and I turned to Strauss to have him join in, and he and Baker were sitting over in the corner making deals among themselves. they were old buddies.
Yeah.
I see Craig has been dying to jump in here. So Craig, go ahead.
Well, I doubt sincerely that Bob Strauss was doing any deal with Jim Baker that might have affected Jimmy Carter's debate position. The debate came about because I mean, it had been danced around since the summer of 1980. Of course, the League of Women Voters had begun sponsoring presidential debates in 1976 and carried the tradition forward. Is that Reagan initially was ambivalent about it, but you have to remember is that in the Republican primaries of 1980, there had been 7 presidential debates between Reagan and Bush and Reagan and the other various candidates, and so Reagan's skills had been sharpened up. Of course, he'd been on the stump constantly, so he was pretty much primed and ready. He also had a very good debate prep team that, as I recall, included George Will and some other Gene Kirkpatrick and some other really superb debate coaches. So Reagan was primed and ready to go. It depends on who you talk to. I mean, the fact is that this was a neck and neck race, and it had been a neck and neck race all through late September into mid and late October. Is just that I can show you polling from both camps, that they had their candidate. But Peter Cadell had polling showing Carter up, and Mari Helpy, who was the Reagan debate pollster in 1980 from Utah. Dick Wirthlin, thank you. He had polling showing Reagan up. And it really just depended on what sample you were drawing and what day you were looking at, and what hour you're looking at. But the fact remains, it was extremely close right up to the day of the debate, and the post debate for the 1 week thereafter is that the post debate commentary all favored Reagan from and not the elites, not NBC or CBS or the Washington Post. But from the little talk radio there was, from polling in the West, is that the rank was a true separation between the elites who said Carter had won and the American people who said that Reagan won. And there was like for focus groups. New York Times did focus groups of individuals after the debate and asking them, and they came down and these were all people from the New York metropolitan area, and they all came down decisively and said that Reagan won the debate. Even though the New York Times editorial was saying that Carter won the debate. So it really was a separation, a real separation for the first time in a long time between the elites of America and the rank and file of America. And it showed up in that 1 week between the debate and the election. Absent the debate, I don't know who wins. I mean, nobody knows who wins. But the fact is that Reagan, with his, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? And the fact, this is a very important point, for the weeks leading up to the debate, is that the Carter campaign, including Jerry, had run a public campaign denigrating Reagan's debate skills. In fact, Jerry produced a memo. The headline was, "Carter is smarter than Reagan." And it had talking points about how Carter was going to beat Reagan, on this issue, on that issue, on national defense and foreign policy. And the Reagan campaign wisely didn't take the bait, said, "Oh no, our guy's going to do better." They just let the Carter people just keep pounding the issue home that Carter was such a superior debater and such a superior candidate, and that he would just ride roughshod over Ronald Reagan. So the expectations game was played too much by the Carter people and played rather brilliantly by the Reagan people.
I don't think that we indulged that much in denigrating Reagan's debate skills as much as the press got behind Reagan. We're talking, how is Jimmy Carter going to go up against Ronald Reagan, who they pretty well conceded that they felt that Reagan had a good chance of putting it away after the debate. The biggest thing that really cinched it or lost it for us was the week after the debate, the last week of the campaign, when we got word that the hostages, we were getting the last demands from the modulus from Iran about the hostages, and Carter was on the road campaigning and was in Chicago when we informed him that we were receiving that night the final debate on the hostages, the final demands on the hostages. And he flew back to Washington, and on Sunday met with his people, Brzezinski, National Security Advisor, and others on Sunday to discuss the demands about the hostages. And it was summed up that there was it was hopeful, but it wasn't going to happen overnight. They had certain demands, but what in the debate, there wasn't any demands that we really had to worry about. And so we asked, the president said, we're going to have to, everybody was watching to see what was coming out of these demands. And we asked Carter what he wants to say. And he said, well, I'm going to say that this is promising, but it is not enough. We're not there yet, but that we will answer their demands. There's certain things we cannot do, but that we will have the pledge that the hostages will be freed before the end of my term, for sure. And somebody said, well, that's just not good enough, Mr. President. And he said, well, what would you say? And this person said, I'd tell them to go, I won't use the word right now, themselves. I think you get the picture.
Yeah.
And Jimmy said, will that get the hostages out? And this person said, but no, but the American people will feel better. Well, he wouldn't do that. He went out there and somebody made the stupid idea of interrupting the Redskins football game for Jimmy Carter to speak about the hostages. And
Jerry, hold on. Let me point out one thing. It wasn't just the Redskins game. It was the Redskins Cowboys football game.
Oh, my goodness.
That's a big game.
Oh,
Americans
well,
love their football.
No wonder Texas went to hell.
Yeah.
I was from Texas.
Yes. But that's the
Anyway.
game. That was a nationally broadcast game that Carter went on national television to interrupt with his.
Tell me about it.
Yes.
Yeah. And so we went back out on the trail. And I think I've told you this before. So I remember that last night, I was not on the trail. Hamilton, Jordan, and I and Cadell went out to dinner, and Pat was going to get the last results from our final poll. And I said, what time are you going to have it, Pat? And he said about midnight. Well, it's be after midnight, be about 3 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning. And I said, call me. I'm going home. Hamilton's going home. 3 o'clock, the White House operator called and said, I have Mr. Cadell on the telephone for you and Mr. Jordan. And we said, what do you got, Pat? And he said, it's over. It is over. He said, and a lot of the things we've been saying, people agreed with about Reagan. But as one lady said, if this little guy Carter can't handle a 2-bit Ayatollah, I'm going to take a chance on the cowboy. And we had to call Carter on Air Force One to tell him, worst night of my life.
So we only have about 5 minutes.
And that was
left.
it.
Yeah. Thank you, Jerry. So we have about 5 minutes left. So I'm going to ask our panelists two final questions. One, we talked about the debate, and in the history of presidential debates, is your general sense that this is one of the most impactful in terms of the ultimate outcome of the election, that the debate itself, I know there are folks who argue that, one of the first televised debate between Kennedy and Nixon, that had a huge impact, just the visual, kind of counterpoint between JFK and Nixon had a big impact. There's some other ones, but, in terms of impact on the ultimate outcome, would you say that this is one of the most consequential debates? Craig, I see you nodding. Go ahead.
Yes, it is. That stuff about Nixon and Kennedy is kind of urban myth. There were 3 subsequent debates after the famous 5 o'clock shadow debate with Richard Nixon and John Kennedy.
Yeah.
And actually Nixon acquitted himself well in those other debates. Is that and the election was just razor thin, 100,000 votes nationwide out of millions cast. And I think that the debates in 1976 were important for Governor Carter because it proved that he could be an acceptable alternative to President Ford. And so in that way, he didn't destroy Ford in the debate, but he did well and he acquitted himself. And so that the American people came away saying, okay, I can see him as President of the United States as opposed to President Gerald Ford. The 1980 debate was, up until 2016, the most watched debate in American presidential history. Over 85 million people watched it, which is astonishing considering the fact that in 1980 there were about 200 million people in the country, which means almost half of the country tuned into the debate. In 2016, you had well over 300 million, and it barely exceeded the viewership of the 1980 debate. But the differences were so sharp, the differences were so clear, is that really Reagan and Carter agreed on nothing. They agreed on nothing in terms of the Soviets. They agreed on nothing in terms of tax policy, abortion policy, social policy. The role of government is that this was a complete cleavage in the American electorate. It's is that Reagan was the conservative candidate, and Jimmy Carter was the left of center candidate. You could get into cultural issues and things like that, but the way the election shaped up is that Reagan was the conservative and Carter was the liberal, and it came down to a contest of ideas and of individuals and who had who had the better ideas going forward. So the answer is, to answer your question, Tony, this was the most consequential presidential debate in American history.
What about the debate that we had last week of the two candidates for president?
I wouldn't say
election?
so. I wouldn't say so. I wouldn't say it was the most consequential.
That it's consequential? No,
Just
it's not.
a couple of points. One is that go back to what Jerry was saying, though. The debate occurred a week before the 1-year anniversary of the hostage taking.
That's right.
Those two things together, you can't separate the impact of those two things together.
All comes to bear. That's right.
And Governor Reagan's challenge in the debate was to, as it were, to pass the presidential threshold, which he was able to do. People were up until then were concerned, worried, doubtful about whether or not he had the
plausibility
so I think the debate was important, but you can't isolate it from the other dynamics at the time.
So Mari, you want to chime in on this?
Sure. Well, I wasn't involved in prepping Reagan at that time, but I used that debate to prep candidates now. I've been involved in almost every presidential campaign cycle since then. And one of the first things I point out to them is how well rehearsed he was. People think Reagan, oh, he was just an actor and used to be in front of the camera. He rehearsed everything right down to his radio remarks when he was back in the White House. And he was very prepared on the issues because it was a contest of ideas, just as Craig says it was. And I think he won on appealing to the right ideas, which has to do with some of the consultants involved. But I also think that his presentation is something that people now should emulate. Which is being a happy warrior. We use that all the time. People think that that's just a given, but it's not. When people get up in a debate, they tend to be very focused and high energy, and their faces tend to almost snarl when they're speaking. They forget to smile. Reagan was always finding an opportunity to smile, have humor. True. He didn't use any harsh lines, but he did have sound bites. And I happen to know that his key sound bites weren't given to him. They were things that he thought of at the moment, because a lot of consultants usually want to put harsh attacks into their candidate's mouth, but he was never for that. And finally, he was just at ease at the podium. That was a product of all his rehearsing, but also his career, obviously. That's hard for people to emulate, but they need to try just by watching him. It was a confidence without arrogance.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
I can't let it go, but he also had the advantage of some inside knowledge about where Carter was coming from because of the briefing book. I don't know how decisive it was, but I know we didn't have the Reagan briefing book, that's for sure. We'd have been a lot more confident too.
Reagan knew nothing about the briefing book, and it had no application to the debate performance whatsoever.
But his people did, Craig.
Yeah, but all it was I saw the briefing book. It was a compilation of news clips and media coverage of Ronald Reagan, what he said, and Ronald Reagan knew what he said. You know, it was to prep President Carter on what Reagan had said in the past 20 years, past 25 years, whatever. There was no Q&A. There was no debate prompts. There was nothing like that. It was a big compilation of news clips and news articles over the past previous years.
That's my understanding as well. And you'll note that the issues that he talked about, his positions on them didn't change in the debate.
Well, if I could, because we're running out of time here, but I do want to give each of you an opportunity for a final word here, and I'd ask you to frame it thus. So we've been talking about, the 1980 election, so an election from 40 years ago. We work with teachers and students from across the country, and so I guess a final point: why is it important to study the past, and why is having an understanding of our nation's history, especially electoral history, important? So I'll leave you with that's kind of a closing thought on why is it important to study things like this, and I'll throw it out to anybody who wants to take that.
I'll
All right. Well, I'll go first. Is that Mari made a couple points about consultants, and I would say that in defense of both President Carter and President Reagan, was just that they had aides, they had assistants, they had people who wrote speeches, things like that, but they weren't run by political consultants, much the way campaigns and candidates are today. Is that there's just too much. The power is shifted. The power used to be with the elected officials, the party leaders, cabinet officials, and the party has shifted now over the years. When I wasn't falling asleep in high school physics, I remember the professor saying, power can neither be destroyed nor created. It can only be moved around. And I found in my life that that's true, and that the power is shifted now to the media classes and to the political consulting classes, which means is that the elected officials and the cabinet officials and people like that have less power. And I think that's a dangerous situation, because they're unaccountable and they're unresponsive to nobody. That's one thing I think why studying 1980 is so important, is that because you're two genuine men who were not managed to a fairly well by their consultants, but instead trusted their own instincts because they had been in front of the voters more than the consultants had. And so I think that is that these past elections are more fun because they're more real, unlike the campaigns of today.
Very well put.
Here's that, and then we have to look at the amount of money. Our budget and the Reagan budget, we were both using public funds that year. I think our budget in the general election total was like $24 million, and this year it's each side spending well over $1 billion, and that distorts the process, and a lot of it driven by the consultant industry that you mentioned, Craig. I mean, that's the scandal, I think.
One last thing, Tony. I also think that one of the things that distresses me most about the environment today in America is that almost none of the rising generation knows anything about our history. There's a lot to be learned. That today, you can't evaluate today without knowing the context of yesterday. You can't evaluate what you think about rights or what norms should be without understanding the Enlightenment. Let's go all the way back there. People don't know our Constitution. They don't know why we have an electoral college. They don't understand how America has worked in the past. And looking at campaigns like this gives you a good idea about how I think it went pretty successfully before somehow it all went into a polarized void.
And big business.
Well said,
Big
Mari.
business of consulting. I would say I would like to appreciate, though, we should appreciate the political consultants that are running the, what is it called? The November group against Trump.
Oh,
what?
Lincoln-
I'm not going to appreciate them. Do you want to get into a discussion about that? I hope they never work in Republican politics again.
Are you talking about the Lincoln Project?
As long as they're successful in this campaign, it's all right with me.
All right, so yeah, an enemy of the Republican Party. There you go.
All right, so on that note, I think, what I'll take away from that final discussion, just the importance of knowing our past, the importance of civic learning, of understanding, our history, of understanding our Constitution. I know that each one of you has dedicated a long career to being participants in the way that our democracy and our republic play out. So I want to thank each of you for your insights, for taking the time to come on today and share your recollections of the 1980 election. We appreciate it, and thank you so much.